Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Elia. I'm joined by Daniel Voskoboynik. This is going to be more of a two-way conversation rather than like a more, let's say, traditional interview, because Daniel is in a rather special place, and because the topic of our conversation is one that it's not the first time we talk about it, of course. We did an episode, it was in September of last year, I think. Yeah, it was because I was still in Switzerland, so it was just before we left. And it was on the topic of memory, reparative memory specifically, and of course the legacy of the Holocaust and the Nakba. I would say that I think you would agree on this that the seriousness even of that topic, which felt quite serious at the time already, somehow managed to get even more serious since then. But we'll get into all of this. This is going to be a conversation about reflecting on the present moment with Gaza, obviously first and foremost in mind, but in, I guess, by now traditional Defy These Times way, it's also going to be about memory in general, how things are being talked about these days, especially when it comes to the Holocaust and the Nakba, and kind of the relationship between those two. And so we'll get into all of this. But first, Daniel, I guess if we can start with, actually, how do you want to start this? Let's put it that way.
Maybe, yeah, where do we even start?
Mm,
I think we had a conversation on these lines months ago, and I think we both shared obviously a deep prayer that at least there would be probably a better timeline. And at the time of us speaking now, on the 6th of August, 2025,
hmm
we've only seen just the horrific intensification of the genocide that we were speaking of already. Um, to the extent that I think the only major difference beyond the intensity of atrocities and horror and mass starvation being more vicious and brutal and lethal than when we last spoke. I think there are at least a change has been in a wider acknowledgement that this is, by all intents and purposes, unmistakably a genocide.
Yeah.
Especially in the last week since we've spoken, I mean, far, far later than it should have happened. We've seen some of the most prominent Israeli human rights organizations clearly state that it's a genocide. We've seen even liberal Israeli intellectuals like David Grossman declared as a genocide. So I think that was not the place we were in a year ago when it already was abundantly clear to anyone, especially made clear to Palestinians, what was happening. But I think we're facing, uh, at least an undeniable reality that even people who have tried to dig their heads into the sand no longer can, I think, deny the undeniable. I think that might be the only major, I don't want to say positive change, but some kind of change ushering us somewhere
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. It's a shame that we haven't, at least not yet, managed to have, this is due to scheduling issues, but not to have Omar Lakkad on yet because his book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This,
Mm,
kind of perfectly summarizes this sentiment and the fact that it was released, what, last year, I think, end of last year,
mm,
says that, I mean, just you and I and other members of FTP from the Periphery Media Collective have been kind of saying this publicly and privately for almost since it started, that the scale of it will be at one point too undeniable, too blatant, too for one, especially not just one, but especially one very specific reason, which is that the Israelis were and are unable to control themselves in the sense
mm,
that they have abandoned from the beginning, clearly, from October 2023, what even before they used to pay more attention in, well, Hasbara or just, you know, denying, just in general, making more effort in terms of how they're presenting themselves and whatnot. And of course, they still do in certain, you know, situations or whatnot, but the scale of it is just too much. And it got to the point where even mainstream, as you said, like just it is in the mainstream, which is a positive change of some kind, but of course there is that bitterness that comes with it. of how things are always too little, too late. That being said, we did an episode recently on the Fire These Times. I don't know when this specific one is going to be released, but we released that one. It's episode 201, I think, with yourself, with Karina, with Isra, and with Layla, reflecting again on this present moment. And the title was something along like this cannot be the new normal. And you're actually phoning in, so to speak, from what used to be the Warsaw Ghetto, and the comparisons are like I don't know what I don't genuinely I don't know what term to use when it comes to like what can even one say when it comes to because comparisons are never good anyway. They're always imperfect. They're always flawed. But I still feel almost this need to, even before knowing that you were there, like I wrote an essay like I don't know a month ago or something, and I brought back also the Warsaw Ghetto because personally it's like by far the uprising is by far the event I've personally delved into the most when it comes to the Holocaust. So yeah, the imageries are there, and it's quite haunting, to use a term I'm using a lot, obviously, these days, to see the parallels, however incomplete the parallels always are. But yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I think people have been right from October 2023 in the first day seeing the intensity of the Israeli assault on Gaza. Already established intellectuals like Masha Gessen were comparing what was happening to the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. So it's not in any ways a far-stretched comparison. But even just
Mhm.
on a basic level, the imagery, I mean, the Warsaw Ghetto is synonymous with starvation. It's synonymous with a policy of of incremental and brutal devastation. And I don't think anyone can look at the imagery of Gaza laid to rubble pretty much and see imagery of what was done in the liquidation and the broader city of Warsaw later on, how it was completely reduced to rubble. The extent that, I mean, at least in the Palestinian solidarity protests in Warsaw, one poster that is common is simply an image of Gaza with a question mark. This isn't Warsaw from 1944. This is Gaza. The
Yeah,
comparison speaks
you
for
showed
itself.
me a sign. You showed me a sign, and quite literally, the top was like in Polish, obviously, was like Warsaw 1944, and then question mark, no, in again in Polish, Gaza 2025. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, to me, the comparison, the echo, the resonance, it's beyond obvious what it takes a significant ideological conditioning, uh, complete unwillingness to see any kind of parallel, to not see the resemblances. And I'm in this city, which is such a complicated, beautiful, deeply heavy city in many ways. But one thing that you see here as well is many tour groups, many coming from Israel, many coming from Germany, who I think are able to witness images of the 1940s in this city and somehow not make a connection or not see that there's any in any way resemblance because of that level of condition. So it's a comparison, while it might be obvious for so many of us, um, it's one worth making in more ways than one because um, we need to, I think, unlearn a culture which tries to place the Holocaust in a place where no resemblance, no comparison is possible. And to me, beyond this just being not true, it's also such an ideology of isolation. If we are unable to make connections, there's absolutely no way we can heal anything in collaboration. And I think we make this comparison from many different like purposes. The first and most important one is to do whatever we can to stop the genocide, to save people's lives and transform this nightmare, wherever that means it will go. But then otherwise, I mean, we're going to have to think through what are we going to do to heal, to build another kind of possible world from the multiple wreckages and ashes, which are here in Poland, in Palestine, and in so many other places as well. But we first need to at least be able to look at suffering and mass atrocity and genocide in ways that allow for not just comparison, but for collaboration. How do you see it?
Yeah. I made that point recently. Usually, there's this you have these books and these kind of videos. You see them on YouTube where you kind of you can color through various techniques old photos that are in black and white or videos even that are in black and white. Um, and the purpose of doing that, of course, is to make those videos and photos more real to us because we have a tendency, I think all of us, to when we see photos in black and white or videos in black and white, it's like automatically rendered into a before. This is like almost the ancient past when of course it's barely a few decades old.
Mm.
And so there are in fact colorized images of the Warsaw Ghetto as well. But for me, I kind of thought what's odd about our present moment is that it's almost like if you reverse things, like if you take as that photo the of the protester in Warsaw, kind of basically the way they put it. But if you take photos and videos of Gaza today, you remove any kind of identifiable marker that tells you that this is, Palestine or whatever.
Mm.
You just would not be able to know which scene, what we're talking about. Is this World War II? Is this Bosnia? You wouldn't think of Bosnia because by Bosnia, of course, it was in the 90s was already in color, of course.
Mm.
But you would be very easily because most images in mind that most people have, videos and photos, when they think of destroyed cities in black and white, it's World War II.
Mm.
Like almost exclusively. That was the big battle before, and very shortly after is when we started having colored picture anyway. So there is an element of that, and you can have easily imagine different scenarios where you would have these, let's say, Israeli groups or German groups going to Warsaw, to Auschwitz, and elsewhere in Poland, and being given photos of what they think is the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, but those photos would actually be from Gaza in black
Mm.
and white, and they would just not be able to know any different. And they would
Mm.
make the same kind of point that they're currently making about the evil of the past. And the way you put it in the essay that you published like an hour ago, and we'll put this in the show notes, like two different interpretations effectively of Never Again. Um, this is a good segue. I absolutely wanted you to talk as much as you can, of course, of because you told me that you went to was it Auschwitz?
Treblinka.
Treblinka, yeah. You went to Treblinka, and you saw two groups of well, visitors, Jewish visitors. One group had keffiyehs around them, and the other group had like Israeli flags. What can you tell us about that kind of moment? Because it's quite something in terms of just the symbolism of it all.
Yeah, I mean, just to put this into perspective,
Yeah.
imagine people who've never been to Treblinka. Treblinka was one of the most horrific uh, death camps where almost 1 million people were executed. And unlike Auschwitz, which maybe people might have a better imagination of what the camp looked like, the Nazi authorities dismantled most of Treblinka to try and cover up the crime and planted a field over the ruins. So what's left now in Treblinka is really just a memorial of stone. Um, and so yeah, when I went, there's multiple different groups that come in. Treblinka is far less visited than Auschwitz. It doesn't have any kind of the tourist infrastructure or visitor infrastructure that Auschwitz has. And there happened to be two Jewish tour groups there. One of them coming to this territory to connect with their ancestors, very much from a place of healing ancestral trauma and and strengthening their commitment to Palestinian liberation. And other folks coming on a tour group from Israel, seeing more on a tour of almost fulfilling the redemptive story that Israel tries to present, which is that there was a Holocaust, but out of the ashes came the state, which in itself proves a never again will we be weak enough to let that happen. And never again that is very much um, and then I'm not going to say individualistic, but a highly narrow interpretation of never again. And these two groups take photos and see the same symbols, mourn, recite the same prayer for the dead, and yet understand the implications of that crime scene in very different. And 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 this is the difficult challenge, I think, a challenge which is at the core of I think so many of the debates on Holocaust studies and genocide studies and memory studies. What does it mean also when what Enzo Traverso calls the civil religion of the Holocaust, has become not just really a weapon almost for justifying another genocide, but in many, many cases, a tool of banalizing uh, the memory of a genocide to commit more crimes, or to at least not allow people to see the connections and see the possibilities of horror and very similar crimes being committed in Palestine. But just that scene, I mean, it's enough to spend hours with this. How we at a point were on the graves, um, of some of the worst crimes that we know of. We have people, I think, very righteously mindedly, um, not making any connection to what their government is doing. And there's like a deep conversation happening at the core of Jewish community life. I think there is a invisible, I don't want to call it civil war, I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but there is a huge battle happening in between at least Jewish communities around the interpretation of the Holocaust. Um, and I think just that image says it all in a way. Some folks who see the honoring of their ancestors completely intertwined with the safety and well-being of Palestinians, and some folks who, from a place of conviction, indoctrination, however you want to understand it, see the justification of might as constant. Um, yeah.
Yeah. In that, for those who know, I'll repeat it briefly for those who don't know. But in the work I did on the politics of Yiddish and Hebrew, which was my thesis like 10 years ago, one of the terms used by one of the historians, I believe, I don't remember the name, was like Kulturkampf, like culture war. Um, if it's not, I mean, it is kind of relevant to this conversation, but it's not directly relevant. But it was a reference to the kind of the summary here in any case, the kind of the culture war, hence the term, between those who were proposing more for like diaspora-centric identity, let's say political identity, and those who were described or kind of favoring a more well, Zionism effectively. So like the way it was kind of summarized, I think the way I summarize is kind of a contrast between or a tension between the here-ness of Doigkeit, which is this Yiddish term, which means here as in Here, here-ness, and Zionism being the there-ness, of course. Um, so I don't know, maybe this is a yet another Kulturkampf in that sense, but one big, although the previous one was that as well, but one definite like added layer this time around, maybe even more notable than last time, let's say like the previous iteration, is that this one I think is truly global and or at least like more global. Um, Whereas the previous one was largely European and American to a very extent, but like a Western affair, let's say, obviously culminating in the Holocaust itself. Um, Whereas now it's very difficult not to see the connections between, for example, like the way Israel has always treated Gaza as a laboratory, and how this absolutely links to various regimes from the Saudis to the Azerbaijanis to even the Chinese that either buy the technology from the Israelis or vice versa, or at least get influenced by them or learn through all of that, and etc. etc. These are things that have been, of course, talked about and written about at length. But the relevance to this specific conversation is it's at the very least it's difficult for me to limit what is happening. Like for me, Gaza is very much a global problem, global question, if you want to put it that way. Not in the not to say that, for example, Sudan right now, or of course Syria in the past, and to some extent today, except like not to say that this is the only example of that, but the way things have been happening when it comes to Gaza, and of course the genocide, is probably the most transparent set of failures when it comes to the responsibility of institutions in the West, various, virtually all of them. That's kind of the thing. That's the kind of the extraordinary thing. Universities with virtually no exceptions. There are some here and there, but virtually no exceptions. Governments with virtually no exceptions. Again, some here and there. And then there are nuances within all of this. Like when we say universities, we usually mean the heads of universities, but not necessarily, of course, the student bodies. And when you say governments, usually at the state or even municipality levels, you would have, not always, but sometimes more diversity and that sort of thing. But in another example, and we'll probably get into this in another episode anyway, more in depth, but the failures of many genocide scholars, even at even recognizing the obvious. Many have since kind of almost caught up, but it's very difficult to not kind of conclude in this kind of almost basic or naive way. I don't know, but like if I knew in October 2023 that this is a genocide, what took them so long? And I'm not a genocide scholar. There is all of these things, and this is like just scratching the surface. The way entire nations from the UK to especially, of course, Germany to, of course, America and so on have been almost like out of control. Like it's almost like there's something in them, and this is just my interpretation. It's not like almost like they're unable to halt, to just stop, to even slow things down. They just it's almost like they can't. I don't know what. Not. I'm saying this is like my interpretation of at least part of what's happening, not to in any way kind of remove the culpability in all of this, of course. But today, what I mean is that there have been many actions and policies and whatnot taken that even from a strictly like selfish, realpolitik or whatever perspective, don't make much sense.
Yeah.
And yet they continue happening to this day. That now the best we can kind of expect is a very, at best, like hesitant, like the UK saying, we will recognize Palestine if you don't stop by September. Stuff like that. And it's so, I don't know what the term is, so mediocre, so banal. I don't know, and I hesitate to use any of those terms given the severity of the situation, but that is part of the difficulty I've had in the sense that, with the exception of the obvious, the Israelis and to various extent the Americans especially, and the Germans to a different extent, it seemed like a lot of those who have either participated or at the very least excused, downplayed, whitewashed this genocide. At times, this isn't applicable to everyone, but at times almost like they didn't entirely know why they were doing it, but still felt like
Yeah.
they had to. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts. I think like I'm kind of in some ways very, I'm not going to say confused because I think at the core of it, I think we've spoken about its moral mediocrity, it's an incapacity to value the lives of other human beings. It's a horror of human hierarchies and some lives just not being worth and valuable as much as others, right? I think
Yeah.
these are things that are clearly true. But I think there's a deeper level, which I think is really also in conversation with people, I think it's almost like the burning question. How is it that it's so abundantly clear what is happening? We have a situation of such devastation, of where it seems like there's nothing that's going to stop it. And yet you have governments, especially in the West, acting as if we're still in some kind of, you know, early stage development. I mean, you just see the statements of the British government. I think also what I come down to, although I think the priorities talk about Gaza, I think there is the abuse of Holocaust memory by Western government. I think sometimes lets on that people have actually learned lessons, have really dealt with the core lessons of the Holocaust with a deep history. And I think that's also abundantly true and that is false. Whether it's the ridiculous failure of denazification in Germany, whether it's the ways in which also the UK government has also often spoken about the Holocaust, especially using examples like the Kinder Transport, which is an incredibly limited and flawed program of support to child refugees, to try and dress
It's
up.
amazing that the Kinder Transport being described as a success story of some kind when it was, I don't know how much we get into this, but when it was in and of itself the result of failures, is phenomenal to me, and I think it speaks so
Yeah.
much to how the Brits, especially in the UK, how they remember, quote unquote, or misremember maybe that period. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
No, I think what I mean to say is if you seriously tackle the memory of the Holocaust, you deal with the violence of borders regimes around the world, that violence could have saved people and it didn't. That's the place that you have to think about, which is highly relevant for the times we're in today and highly relevant to think about Gaza. So I don't think people have done much work in any way to really incorporate the lessons of the Holocaust. And and now we're in a situation where we have even far more work to do, where it's going to be an enormous task for people who have spent years now doubling down and burying their heads to the sand. And I think it's partly that attitude of the worse it gets, the more difficult it is to acknowledge complicity. Um, and it's easier to kick the can down the road. But things are becoming so drastically horrifying, even
The
more so than they
wider,
were a year ago. Yeah.
yeah, sorry, the wider the reality gap is, the more there are incentives to either double down and to fill that gap with if effectively a combination of wishful thinking, magical thinking, conspiracy theories, obviously hate, all of the above, depending on the different combinations will depend on the individual basically. But there from the very get-go, those who have kind of realized or publicly declared what this is, that this is a genocide, are not have not kind of had the same trajectory, intellectually speaking, or more whatever, as those who have been denying it and continue to deny it to this day. And separately, but linked, those who have recognized it, but ridiculously late. Like B'Tselem recognized it a month ago, a few weeks ago. It's absurd how long that took. It's like good in the sense that it's better late than never, sure. But the fact that it took so long, when I was still living in Geneva, and this was during in the beginning, I think it was like November, December 2023, I was at this talk, and there was at least two, I believe, special rapporteur of the UN, who were there because, of course, the UN is in Geneva, and both of them were saying that it's so blatantly obvious that this is a genocide. And we're talking a month into it, a month, maybe a month and a half into it. One of them, I'm spacing out on his name at the moment, but he said like, I'm not a genocide scholar, and that seems to be how I know that this is a genocide. And this is it's a extraordinary thing that has happened. Um, for those who don't know, I mean, maybe you've already listened to it, but the episode I did with Amos Goldberg was who is this Israeli historian of the Holocaust for that matter, and of genocide in general. This came about because he wrote this piece and as part of the Journal of Genocide Studies, I think, something like that. That's ongoing. They've had this open forum reflecting on the field, or rather the impact that the ongoing genocide in Gaza has had on the field, because they, among the few, I mean, to their credit, have recognized early on that there is clearly a pretty serious crisis, to put it mildly, and that if you spend decades effectively as part of this field studying and identifying genocides, it's impossible that you have missed even if before October, if you have missed kind of the what how 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 primed Israeli society has been for quite some time now, um, to enact this genocide. How the fact that it took the retribution, the revenge against Palestinians, collectively punishing them for the Hamas attack of October 2023, um, the speed it took, the scale it took, and the relentlessness, the inability, again, almost as if they cannot control themselves. And to some extent, I
Mm.
actually think this is true in the sense that there are lots of individuals within the IDF. Some have said so, some proudly, some like regretting it or whatever. The effect is, of course, the same, that they were in this frenzy of mass death and mass killings. This was apparent from the get-go, from the beginning, at least to many of us. What told me personally that something different was because in the early days I didn't know necessarily how Europe is what I had in mind would react, and to some extent how America would react. America, I guess I was less surprised because it's fucking America. It was still, I think it took us, I think most of us were still kind of shocked at the extreme, like how far Biden would go to just support the genocide at all costs and fund it and arm it and so on. And then, of course, Trump took on that mantle later on. But for me in Europe, there was a bit of I wondered basically, like to what extent are they willing to go, basically. And one of the earliest signs for me that told me that they may actually go to that extent. They may actually go to the full extent, just supporting it or at the very least denying it, downplaying it, and so on. Kind of like Keir Starmer, who's this supposedly human rights lawyer, saying that he knows what genocide is and this is not genocide. Kind of like the extent they would go to support it and to downplay it, or to downplay it, is actually how they have reacted to and I'm speaking, I'm thinking specifically of the UK and Germany and France to a different extent, to like Jewish voices who were opposing the genocide because it's very specific, and that's something that I hope through this podcast in general, but it still frustrates me how it's not more widely understood that it doesn't have to make logical sense, but it can still be revealing. Um, because it is specific how, let's say, a German state, uh, the German state itself, I mean, or the British state or whatnot, how they would react to, let's say, British Jews or German Jews or Jews in Germany, like Israelis and so on, who have opposed the genocide and so on. Um, because it goes back to their own history. In some sense, it doesn't have much to do with Palestinians whatsoever, the way they would react to them. Um, because it sometimes there was violence, and of course in Germany especially, but most of the time it was by actually quite literally pretending that they don't exist and just ignoring them completely, and actually just uh, literally picking the effectively the good Jews, like the one that they approved of, the chief rabbi of the UK, the various ones in Germany, not chief rabbis, like the various voices in Germany and so on, because they would say the things that by now I think we're used to, like anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. We feel unsafe because of this Palestine protest, etc., etc. Um, and the performativity of it all. I watched like 2 hours, I think, of the D-Day celebration. Not the one this year, which was actually even more revealing, I think, than the one last year, but the one of last year in 2024, because it was so performative. And so talking about the defeating the evils and so on and so forth, and of course laying the wreaths and speaking to the few veterans that are still with us and so on. Um, and I felt sick to my stomach, like generally watching this. The hypocrisy of it all being, of course, a big part of it. But again, I go back to that term, the banal, just how on in interest. I don't know, I don't genuinely don't know what terms to use. Like how underwhelming. Yeah, that's maybe that. How underwhelming it is that they can make these speeches clearly written by someone else, feel nothing maybe in them. I have no idea. And at the same time, do the very obvious thing, not even that many kilometers away. And that's why, like in the essay I released yesterday, I think I described like this is cowardice. I was channeling James Baldwin, like he spoke about like moral cowards, and it is that, and it's something that to this day I still genuinely struggle with, in that I don't see that much evil in that sense, in the sense of people being evil, or like them like as human beings being evil, but their acts are. And either the active acts, like the things that they actually do, of course, or the passive ones, or the inactive ones, or the indifferent ones, and so on, which can be the same result.
Mm.
And that's what that the zone of interest again. This kind of came to mind. Of course, we had the conversation on mostly on that film last year when we last chatted on this topic in September of 2024. Because I mean, for those who don't know it, I highly recommend watching it. It's not an easy watch. Um, But effectively, the zone of interest is a term that the Nazis used. And it's like this, the family of the guardsmen of, I think it's Auschwitz. And you see them, you see no Jewish person. You only see the Nazis, and their families, basically. And it's like this, this officer and whatever, and you see them and the I don't know, the backyard and the swing and the kids playing there and all of that. But you see in the background, literally in the background, you see Auschwitz. But you don't really see it. You see a bit of the tower, you see the smoke, of course, and you know what this is. You know what these things are because you're watching it in 2024 or whatever. Um, but the point in what makes this film very, very powerful is that if you didn't know what you were watching, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you wouldn't understand the film. You wouldn't get it. It would be a very weird film. You wouldn't know what's happening. There's no action really, you know,
Mm.
nothing much at least. Um, and the only time we see in the entire film, I won't get into it as much because we talked about it last year, but the only time we see in the entire film when that you see one person who seems genuinely bothered by what's happening, by the fact that she is quite literally on the other side of where she is. There is a death camp. is, I think, the mother of the wife of the main guy or something like that, who at some point just felt like this is too much and just left, like didn't leave a note, or maybe like just left without telling anyone. And that's it. That's the only time. But
Mm,
throughout the entire film, what makes it very, very uneasy and very difficult to watch is that the, you spend moments watching it where you can forget what's happening in the background because it's in the background and you're not seeing it all the time. There, you don't hear screams. It just, or maybe you do if you. I mean, like you don't. There's. It's not like most of it. It's just, yeah, a bit of the kind of ambient sound, music, whatever, and then the machinery of a of what we know of to be the Holocaust, and that's why I think it is genuinely one of the most powerful ones I've seen on the Holocaust, because in many ways it's applicable. It's very specific to the Holocaust because the Nazis were like the ones who kind of pioneered, if you want, the industrialization of genocide. Or of course they were not the first ones to do it, but they did it at a different scale. The technology in many ways allowed it to for them to do it. But and of course this why the director himself felt that there is a connection to Gaza. You could see the comparisons to Gaza. Whereas even at the time I mentioned like Gaza is more global, but the Holocaust, the links between Hugo Boss and IBM and the various Western companies that were still allowed to operate and even and finance and all of these things. It's so difficult not to see the parallels, except if you don't want to see them. You know, like ultimately, or you have ideological filters preventing you from seeing them. I don't care, but the end result is sort of the same.
yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the, genocide studies has offered us anything, and there's one insight obviously that's come through studies of many genocides, which is this idea of cumulative uh, radicalization or cumulative dehumanization. But the idea that like what's happening now, what the Israeli army is doing, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's been a process of decades of building up infrastructures of dehumanization. Let's just take the educational system. We've mentioned the work of Nurit Beled Al-Hanan and her research into Israeli textbooks. There was research done, I think, 40 years before in the 1970s by another Israeli scholar called George Tamayan, who looked at were Israeli kids in primary school, how was like the introduction of biblical study, how a particular stories about military conquest in the context of biblical study were being used to really normalize violent, almost genocidal actions in the minds of very, very young. Now, this is like a complete departure from traditions of Jewish learning on the Torah, which emphasize huge amounts of interpretation, have a really rich nonviolent tradition. But especially from the construction of the State of Israel, you have the beginning of highly militarized educational formation of Jewish youth, right? Well, that shows us, first of all, this process has been going on for decades. There is enormous questions to be asked around. Let's just talk for the EU for a second, but the the role of European states in facilitating Israel's impunity goes over decades. It's not just the case in the last 2 years. This has been a process of accumulation, and now it's all the forces have collided, and we're facing this explosion of an energy that has been building up for years that is incredibly difficult to contain. And now, there's massive campaigns for sanctions and many, many more extreme measures, but even those we're unsure about what they could do, especially with given how far to the right Israeli society has moved. And but this is a process that's been cumulative, and this is a process which, at least to me, what it forces us to think about. We had Abdullah Naim, the incredible human rights scholar, on this podcast a few years ago. He talks a lot about the ecology of morality, right? We live in societies that shape us ecologically. What we're enabled to do morally very much depends on that. And if we're talking about Western politicians where those power systems just reward obedience and reward political convenience and do not in any case reward moral integrity or moral leadership, then what are we going to see, especially in states complicit in colonial genocide and moral mediocrity over generations? You have just a deepening of the status quo, and I think an incapacity to meet this historical moment with any of the lessons that people claim to have learned. But I think that leaves the challenge to us quite clear, which is we have to transform the ecologies of morality. I don't know what that looks like. It looks very different in Israeli society, what it looks like in Germany or the UK or the US. And this is, we're talking about Gaza in the context of far-right radicalism and fascism across the board. So it's not easy, but I think it's something we have to at least be more lucid about how we do it.
Yeah. Um, I think the genocide being kind of a global one. Of course, the intent in saying that is not to downplay the very specific Israeli culpability here. Although I generally would argue that the genocide is an American-Israeli genocide, especially. And you can absolutely argue it's an American, Israeli, German, and then you add all of those that are the most culpable. I'll leave that to the
Mm,
lawyers. Um, how do I say this? The reason why I'm even struggling to use the term to know which term to use, like, is this banality? Is this mediocrity? Is this just underwhelmed? Is that it's difficult to otherwise make sense of it, and because it's difficult to make sense of it, kind of that's what leads me to conclude that it's not making sense for those who perpetrate who are on that side, like the I don't know this the German politicians, the British politicians, and so on. And most importantly, it doesn't have to. Like I don't know what's in their mind. I don't care. But the kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? What's damning this world for me, like what's at least very least the West, but not just the Arab states are very much on my mind as well. But especially what's damning, especially the West, I mean, is the fact that they are part and parcel of creating this genocide, creating the infrastructure that has made it even physically possible. Now, first and foremost, the American, of course, a virtually unconditional and unlimited support in the form of money, in the form of funds, in the form of weapons. There has been like a like party tradition in America for several decades now. When it comes to Europe, it's almost like for me, it's a bit more damning even. I don't know. I don't like the hierarchy. It's just that damning in a different way because Europe is literally responsible for this, for the Holocaust. And then we get into kind of the nuances of it all. And that's why, like, a couple of years ago, I was on this podcast and I said, like, honestly, I'm still angry about the Holocaust. Because the way it's told, the way it's talked about in Germany, of course, differently in Germany, in the UK, in Poland, we've known for some time, of course, that the Polish government has tried to just distance itself from basically the Polish culpability of it all. France has been doing this for even longer. Um, and it has been even like not just a right-wing thing, but sometimes even a left-wing thing of saying like, we're not responsible for the Veldiv, which is the mass deportation of French Jews by the French police, which they even did it from out of their own initiative before the Nazis even asked them to do it, if I remember correctly. And the argument is that this wasn't us because, well, we were in London. De Gaulle, the government in exile, it was in London. So the Vichy government, the collaborationist government, that was not France, which is, of course, a very convenient thing to say. But the point is that at virtually every kind of step or at every turn, when it comes to this history, it was about me, or us, or the nation, France, Germany, Poland, the UK. How many, sorry, how many World War II films are there? And how many of those are about the actual failures to stop the Holocaust? We of course have, and this isn't a critique necessarily of the ones that were made, but rather of those that were not made. Schindler's List, of course, one man who was a genuine hero, Oscar Schindler. And you would have films here and there, usually indie films, documentaries, kind of going more into the nitty-gritty of it all, like why didn't we stop it before? Like, and it gets to like the more you read it, and that was definitely my experience, is that I felt and I still feel genuine anger when it comes to the Holocaust because there were so many and people were writing about it at the time. That's what's so difficult about it. There were so many signs that this is what's going to happen next. And then when the next thing happened, well, this is what's going to happen after that. And after this is what's going to happen after that. Because fundamentally, once you kind of understood in many ways the Nazi formula, the rest wasn't rocket science. It was pretty obvious where this was going. And it was because they were saying it. It's not, again, in different ways. But there was so much incentives one of the things I always kind of am reminded of and still kind of shocks me to this day. A couple of examples. I'll try and go through them relatively quickly because I want to talk about modern Germany especially. But the Nazis had this concept of honorary Aryan, right? And effectively, like high-ranking Nazis, usually Hitler or someone next to him, or close to him, I mean, in rank, would say like this person is an honorary Aryan. Or in the case of Japan, was the entire Japanese population. And honorary Aryans were usually, or often, people who had some Jewish heritage. Famously or infamously, I believe it was Hitler's driver or something like that. He said, you're an so that he gets protected. But there is this one other example that for me is kind of the most revealing one. I forgot her name at the moment, but she was a an athlete that wanted to participate in the Olympics in '36, of course, in Berlin, which was already in the Nazi era had started. She was of Jewish origins or had part heritage, whatever. And because of the Nuremberg Law and everything in Germany, had fled Nazi Germany and went to America. But she wanted to compete for her nation. She wanted to compete for Germany, even though it was by then the Third Reich. And the Nazis had agreed to make her a honorary Aryan so that she can compete in the Olympics. She did the Sig Heil because she won like one of the medals. I don't know which one, whatever. And then after that, I believe had to go back to America. And then after the war, went back to Germany and died in Germany. So like for me, this is someone who like just in this one person's life, you see kind of the contradictions of this world, how it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be logical. That even Adolf Hitler, fucking Adolf Hitler himself, was able to have exceptions. Actually, no, this guy is a good Jew, you know? Which tells you a lot. It was like this is ultimately it was also political. It was something that clearly deeply felt by the Nazis that this is they have to solve the Jewish question through the genocide. Um, but even those guys had the kind of the nuances within them because they were fucking humans. And in my mind, this is why I'm struggling with that term. In many ways, were mediocre in the sense like again, I'm struggling with those terms. Maybe it's the wrong term to use. I'll think about this more. The second example was the how I believe this was the first day of the when the Warsaw Uprising started. There was one of those conferences. Apologies to Caribbean folks. It was either Barbados or Bermuda. I think it was Bermuda. Where you had, I think it was especially like the Americans and Brits that were meeting there in order to decide what to do with the refugee question, and they ended up kind of not deciding actually. And that's where the banality again comes into my mind. Like they could have made the decision that would have at the very least saved a bunch of people's lives. It just did not. They just did not. It was just not a priority. Bombing the railways on the way to the Holocaust, to the death camps, which were known, were identified at the very least as concentration camps where a lot of people were being killed. Were not done because the Allies did not know whether they may need those or whatever. Like stopping the Holocaust was never seen as a priority. And that's something at the not even top, like it was just not seen, it was not part of the calculations. The calculations, of course, was to defeat the Nazis because by then they were on it and so on. So the more you get into sort of the different phases of World War II, the more what's happening now starts making sense, in this cold, horrible way. Because fundamentally, the ultimate horror of the Holocaust, which it's kind of the most obvious symbol when it comes to World War II, at least to many people, was not that at the time. Was not seen as that by most of the world at the time. It was seen that later. And then when even did it start becoming as important to in the UK or in Germany and whatnot, had more to do with like British history and politics and German history and politics and so on and so forth, than it had to do with like the individuals who were killed in those gas chambers and in death camps. And it's difficult like not to imagine like a very similar things in what the difference is that the different context and time and the world has changed and whatever would of course allow, but fundamentally a very similar one is already happening. You already have the reputation laundering, like France is going to recognize Palestine and the UK maybe will, and even Germany is sort of saying, oh, but this is not entirely justified or whatever. And why would they bother even with any of this if they weren't if they were fully into it, why would they bother? But they're not. But it doesn't matter. And that's the thing. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
whether they're fully into it. At least it doesn't matter as much as it should, whether they're fully committed to this genocide or not. They just need to be committed enough to, at the very least, not do anything to stop it or participate in it, and of course, crack down on those who are trying to demand that you take more action or any action for that matter, and at the very least, stop your complicity at home. The UK comes to mind, of course, but Germany as well. So yeah, bit of a lot all over the place on that.
No, no, I'd love to read something that you wrote recently because I think it helps us kind of ground the challenge, and I'd love to hear us to think about what are possibilities for us to do as well together. So what you've written is what the cowards do not understand is that the Jewish question, in other words, European anti-Semitism, is still with us today. It has just morphed into a dual Jewish and Palestinian question, two questions in one, inseparable. One thing this means is that just as European Jewish intellectuals were particularly well suited to understand and expose 20th century fascism, we, the Palestinians, the Arabs, their Jewish allies, and all racialized Untermensch who are today particularly well suited to do the same for the 21st version of it. I want to hear more of your thoughts, and what strikes me initially, I think, is the importance of being incredibly clear on this, is that the crime being committed against Palestinians has many perpetrators, but the dumping of the Jewish question on Palestinians, the construction of Palestinians, and the transposition of Nazism onto Palestinians, which is so disgraceful and disgusting and absurd to many degrees. To me, it's always struck me how quick people are to elide all the colonial history. I want to always remember that Balfour, in the Balfour Declaration, famously says that one of the purposes of the Balfour Declaration was to correct an error, which is you have a group, the Jews, who are a hostile and alien part of the body politic that cannot have refused to be assimilated or normalized into the European body politic. So this was the best solution to expel them and to give them a place outside of Europe, right? The inability of this continent, which I think is a metaphor for many other parts of the world and for the colonial mentality more generally, to handle plurality, difference, diversity, and undo the violence of borders is at the core of this. It's at the core of the Jewish question. It's at the core of the way in which Muslims and Arabs are now being positioned into playing the role that Jews have played historically in Europe. Um, but yeah, I'm curious on what brought you to write this, and how do you think we can build this kind of coalition of solidarity that I think you're hinting at?
Fundamentally, this is kind of the James Baldwin's insight. Not that he was the only one, of course, but that exchange that I've mentioned probably dozens of times on this podcast alone of like when he kind of had this realization, he described it as I'm not the N-word. Right? Like, and I've never been that, and I don't know anyone that I know who's black who has ever been that, and yet I've been called that, and clearly societally there was a need for an N-word. Um, and so the power that I think when he realized that kind of this gave him the agency that he needed, and he then shared with the world, and in many ways taught me to also have agency in that sense, is recognizing, realizing that those others, in this case, white people, in inventing themselves as white, because there's no such thing as white. It's not something that has ever existed before it was created socially as a social construct. They needed an other. They needed an N-word to construct themselves. And so fundamentally, he said like you have to he said that you have to figure out why you felt the need to have an N-word in the first place. I'm giving you back the problem or something like that. He put it along those lines. And for me, it's one of the reasons why I'm particularly angry when it comes to Germany. Like it pisses me off to such like I can sometimes not control myself very well, so I do something, I go and I watch something else to calm myself down, because I generally feel it very, very strongly. More so than the UK, although the UK is a different type of anger, which is, trust me, just as vivid. But with Germany, like, it's this, like, how fucking dare you, you know? Just this, like, how dare you? But they dare. Because they, in the same way that to this day, in my view, and I don't think it's even that controversial, like the average German does not see the Jew. Does not exist. It's not part of the cosmology of what it means to be German. Only with the exception being, I mean, when it's Israel, and when it's Israel related, that even German Jews now are interpreted or kind of dealt or like talked about, or you often about rather than talk to, I should note, through this lens. And what is this lens? This is the lens of a foreign body. This is the lens of a foreignness to the German Jew, who of course is not foreign, is German. But still, there is that. And Israel has provided this quintessentially, especially, it's a European problem, but an especially German problem. The perfect get out of jail, card that they have been using thus far. And now I think it's quite interesting because I'm not entirely sure that that card works as well anymore. Because again, it's just one of those things. Maybe it's just too much now for even them to pretend to for too long. I don't know. We'll see. I'm more pessimistic about Germany than I am about most other places, but that doesn't matter right now. We know that we have a disproportionate number in many ways of Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century who are well known in the sense of like critical thinkers, left-wing Marxists. It's part of why the Nazis were obsessed with this whole Judeo-Bolshevik crap. It's because I mean, in my interpretation, I'm sure I'm not the only one to have said this, but that they were the ones targeted most viciously, most viscerally, and so that in the same way as with James Baldwin and the black people in America, a number of European Jews, just as a number of African Americans, ended up sort of realizing at one point that wait, the problem is not us, clearly, because the way they're talking about the Jew or the N-word in the case of America doesn't resemble anyone that I know who is Jewish, or in the case of America, who's black, and so on. And yet they keep on talking about this character, this person. And of course, the Nazis are kind of the most cartoonishly obvious. They have literally the Untermensch and these quote unquote documentaries, which are, of course, propaganda films and whatnot. And so, where did that come from? Why is there this need? You have the very kind of easy, easy in quotation, I don't know, but like maybe fastest way of interpreting all of this, which is like, well, it's convenient and they need a scapegoat. And it's like, yeah, yeah, okay. But why? What is this? If they need a scapegoat in order to have this imagined community, to of course cite Benedict Anderson, what happens if they don't have the scapegoat? Are they still are they still a community? Is there a Germany without anti-Semitism? I don't know. I know
Hmm.
that they clearly have found a different way of having what still in many ways still is the same anti-Semitism without necessarily needing to mention any Jewish person anymore. But functionally, structurally, like it's almost like a very similar DNA. Because the way like Arabs in general, Muslims as well, and of course specifically Palestinians, and the fact that those three are interchangeable in and of itself is already very, of course, revealing. This imposes a multitude of erasures. The Palestinian Christian, does that person even exist? You know? Are there Jews who are half Palestinian? They erased. All of those complexities, all of those things, these are all erased. And so what are you left with? You're left with, in my opinion, basically an Untermensch. A racialized, for those who don't know, it's like subhuman, basically. But that's the term that they use for Jews, and not just Jews, for Roma and Sinti and Slavs and so on, and homosexuals, the people with disabilities and so on. You're left with that. And they don't need to use those terms anymore. There's no need for that. But functionally, it kind of the what's scary, if you want, in many ways, is that it's not that this would necessarily lead to like a Holocaust 2.0 because structurally there's no need for this anymore. Because A, we live in a global world. B, they've already massacred the most Jews who were in Europe. And now they don't need to solve quote unquote the Jewish question. I think they think that they don't. Which again, for those who don't know that specific term, it's a historical term. It refers to European anti-Semitism. They think that they don't need, but what actually happened, and that's the thing that you just cited, is that they haven't understood that the Jewish question was never answered. It was just transposed into Palestine. And that's, Reifes Reich and others have said the same thing, that like, therefore, if you've refused to answer it And you said like basically it's this is your problem now, you the Middle East, you whatever. Well, that doesn't make it disappear. It just perpetuates it as a question. And it has been mixed, of course, through these various historical processes into the Palestinian question as well. But crucially, I don't think those are separable anymore. Maybe a few
Yeah.
decades ago, I have no idea. But right now, I genuinely don't think those two are separable anymore. And so that gives me, if you want, some kind of agency in the sense that as a Palestinian or just an Arab, whatever from that region, to channeling Baldwin, he realized, well, I'm not this Arab, the way the Arab is the same term, but the way it's talked about is more like the N-word. I'm not this foreigner, I'm not this whatever. So why do you feel the need to create that category? So I throw back the problem at you. And that's kind
Mm.
of the motivation behind that sentiment, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's also clear. I mean, I kind of want to uplift that sentiment because I do think that we're facing very challenging circumstances, and how we build alliances is going to be crucial. So much, at least, of what I noticed, at least from Jewish organizing, is the politics of divide and rule have prevented us from building coalitions that can challenge colonial legacies across the board. Imagine if we could build coalitions. Let's just take France, for example. France is complicit in such horrific crimes against Jews, but also against Algerians, for example. What could be gained if those collectives, which also aren't in any way mutually exclusive, um, with the amount of also Algerian Jews that are in France, what could be done if there could be alliances built there? In Germany already, the coalitions of Palestinian Jews who are organizing in solidarity with Palestine. But we need to have the imagination, I think, to make these seemingly impossible alliances happen if we want to try and bring this question to place it back against the powerful. But I would want to also repeat to people is Palestine for people maybe who struggle to see the connections. Palestine gives people what I try and do in workshops on Holocaust memory is also to allow people to see everything that you're seeing now, the destruction of hospitals, the destruction of medical infrastructure, the demolition of educational infrastructure, the thieving of people's dignity and life wealth. This is exactly also what happened in the Khurban. And the crime of absolutely demolishing an educational infrastructure in the case of Eastern Europe, which was what provided people an enchanting alternative to Zionism. We need to bring that back. The Nazi authorities in the German state are complicit in the removal and the destruction of countless amounts of educational, cultural, and medical institutions. But if they existed, we wouldn't be in the same situation we are now. I can't say that we'd be in a better place, but what's playing out now doesn't play out if we have robust social movements all across where Jews were mass murdered across Europe. So I think we have a task of, I think a question that you always ask really powerfully is the what if, what could have been in history, and I mean the tragedy of Palestine is in many ways the tragedy of all the roads not taken. But with where we're at now, where we're not just facing, I think, the prospect of an even more horrifying genocide in Palestine. I don't think that Israeli fascism is going to stop there. Already the plans are far wider, and it's almost, the horrors also even swallow the fact that we're still talking about what does it mean to hold Israel accountable for crimes committed in Lebanon. Just only very recently in Syria, ongoing. So this is going to be a major dismantling fascism both in Israel, but its connection in the United States. And it's going to be an enormous task, but we're going to need solidarities and affinities and collectives far more imaginative than a lot of the politics we have available to us. And I think that your piece, I think, invites us very powerfully to see the questions as indistinguishable, connected through the wound, but perhaps we can connect them also through vision as well.
And maybe we can slowly wrap up on this point. One of the things that for me, I describe my kind of studying of the Holocaust almost in two phases, before and after. Before it was researching, reading was just part of a process of discovery, almost innocently or whatever. It was generally, I can remember very well, I was in Ain Saadeh, where I'm from, in Lebanon, going through Wikipedia, spending hours just doing that. And it's one of those things where like you open in a new tab and whatnot. Very, very straightforward kind of situation. And then I read about this and I read about that, and I remember very distinctly when I discovered about the bombing of Guernica, and I remember the Warsaw Ghetto, all of those things. Guernica in Spain, of course, obviously. this was kind of the before in the sense that like and it was around the same time that I would then watch the films, The Pianist later on, but especially Schindler's List in the beginning and all this, and the Shoah, the very long documentary and so on. As part of this process of just just understanding what happened and how bad it was and so on. But this was the before. The after, like the thing that kind of clicked at one point, is how preventable it was. And that, squaring that with how D-Day is remembered, Victory Day in Europe, of course, how the films, for them, not all of them, but most of them talk or portray even the liberation of the camps, and usually it's like I don't know which film it was, but you have like Soviet soldiers in front of like Auschwitz and them being horrified. You have these dialogues of like, why are there Jews? And it becomes kind of this shocking thing. And not to say that there weren't, of course, soldiers on the front line who were genuinely shocked. Of course there were, because they're humans. But then how this is told in a way that ultimately it's, part of why Putin is so, to this day, still very bitter about the fact that Russia isn't included, because for him the USSR is Russia, of course, isn't included in those D-Day celebration remembrance in the same way, like how as he sees it, the overwhelming sacrifice that the Soviets did to defeat the Nazis is not seen as front and center, and part of his bitterness is precisely those Holocaust films, World War II films, I mean, specifically, including Holocaust ones, overwhelmingly show Americans and Brits, overwhelmingly. So all of that. I'm not gonna get into Putin right now, but this after, once that clicked, and of course then reading the books, the Primo Levis of it all, and all of that, um, I couldn't unlearn it. I couldn't kind of get rid of this almost nagging feeling that I have whenever I would see again the D-Day stages. I'm thinking about it because it was here like what, a few months ago or something. They did it here as well. And how did they do it in the UK with a bunch of Union Jacks? Because it was about us defeating them. It wasn't about the victims of them. It really wasn't, and it isn't. It still isn't to this day. Um, anyway, this gets more messy and complicated than this conversation will allow. But the anger that I still generally feel to the Holocaust for me is also about reclaiming, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising as part of my history and not part of the German state or the Polish state for that matter. Of individuals, sure, that depends on them, individual Poles and whatever, that depends on how they end up kind of relating to it. And when I'm saying reclaiming, I'm not, of course, saying this is about me because it's not. I'm not Jewish, I'm not of Polish origins, all of that, I'm not that. But it was an uprising by Untermenschen, those who were called Untermenschen, but who kind of, again, to channel Baldwin again, never recognized that, didn't see themselves as that, because why would they? And so they almost like in this, I'm putting it a bit poetically, so listeners don't take this too literally. But almost like once there was this realization, again, channeling Baldwin here, that we're not the N word, so we got to do something about it. That kind of moment that I'm imagining happened, even though there wasn't like a light bulb or anything, more of a process. And so for me, it's like, well, if okay, I'll try and make most additional sense, hopefully, by saying this right now. We've heard, of course, a lot on this podcast as well, a lot of friends and whatnot talk about despair and hopelessness. And I generally think those are understandable emotions, but fundamentally emotions that shouldn't be left to fester, left to just stay and internalize or whatever, because fundamentally it's disarming. It makes us, of course, weaker as a group, I mean, as communities. And makes us feel defenseless and lost and all of that stuff. And I think you yourself said, like, you did, that fascism thrives on disorientation. And I want to stop that. It doesn't just happen. And I'm saying just if we all wake up one day, we will stop it just as it is. No, but it is part of that process. It can't happen otherwise. Or it will be much more difficult to stop it otherwise. So I think this is where we're at now. Is that of course, I've repeated this in the essay, and I'll repeat this again. The top priority right now is doing whatever we can to just stop this, and that's it. That's it, or at least that's the first step to just stop this genocide. While doing this, we need to, of course, hold Israel accountable as much as is possible. While doing this, which is of course very difficult, hold the states where we're in accountable as much as is possible, and so on and so forth. Part of doing that, for me, and I will end on this point, is identifying what can I actually do as an individual, and then parallel to that, what can I do as part of something wider, bigger than myself, as part of a community, as part of the FTP collective, as part of what have you. Those are two questions, separate questions, but also interconnected, of course, because otherwise we are disoriented, and fascists are not as disoriented. And I need us, and I'm saying the very collective us, everyone listening, etc., to do our best to at the very least be less disoriented, which in no way means downplaying what's happening. On the contrary, in order to be able to tackle the specific problem that we are all dealing with, at the very least, we will all be dealing with in at some point in the near future, if you're not directly affected by it yet. I'm talking about fascism. Because we're there. The whole it could happen here, could it happen here? That's it. I think we should stop asking these questions. We're there. We are there. We are at the fascist phase, if we want to think about it in phases. The question is now, how do we stop it? And how do we weaken it? How do we kill it? How do we disorient it? How do we, all of that stuff? And this will have different answers depending on where you are. But fundamentally, you cannot have these answers if you don't recognize what the actual problem is and what the question is, i.e., how to defeat them. I'll end on that point, unless you have, and just wait for your thoughts. And unless you have like a question or whatnot, we'll end it at that.
I think a quote from Baldwin comes to mind, which I think we
Hmm.
brought him up a lot. Yeah, the children is ours. The children
Yes.
of the Warsaw Ghetto, the children of Gaza, and even the children, for many folks, it might be difficult to humanize. But children who are 3 and 4 in Israel, who, as a survivor from Kibbutz Be'eri said, I don't want to live in a world where the first question that kids ask isn't what do I want to be when I grow up, is what role am I going to play in the army? It's a
Mm.
disgraceful reality for those kids, and I think that's in a way our biggest hope. Fascism is a terribly impoverished of what it means to be a human being. It offers us very little, and it asks for enormous costs, primarily from intervention, of course, but from the souls of every single person, from the hearts of every single person. So that's one of the best things that we have is our offer to people, our offer of vision is will always be far richer and more beautiful and worth living for than what fascism can ever offer, which is at best the misery of privilege. So I think that's something that we can work with. We can work with it to counter Zionism. We can work with far more visionary ideas of what we can do together. But yeah, it's not easy. But I think as we've been saying, we have to have at least some kind of vision. Um, yeah, people will succumb to despair, as many have already. Um, the the Holocaust that we spoke about beforehand, the amount of people that took their own lives afterwards was a second devastation because of the despair of seeing a world that did not learn. And I think that's also our task is to build a world where at least we can dream and also navigate the enormous crises that we face even far beyond Palestine in some kind of unified way.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful note to end on. So, Daniel, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Abby.